Welcome to the deep dive. We like to take something really meaty, a single source packed with good stuff, and pull out the core insights, the nuggets of wisdom. And we do it so you can, well, get up to speed quickly, maybe even see the world a little differently.
Yeah, it's like we've done the sifting, the digging, and now we're presenting you with the gold, so to speak.
And today we're spelunking into chapter 3. It's called Spirit of Renewal,
From
the Built for Greatness, Built for God movement handbook.
okay, yeah, the Christian edition of the Tao Te Ching.
Exactly.
Right off the bat, what grabs me about this chapter is how it talks about renewal in a way that almost it feels bigger than just one religion.
Totally. Like, we all want meaning, we all want peace, and this chapter seems to speak to that. So our mission today is to really dig into what it means by renewal, how it kind of flips the script on some of our usual ideas about power, wealth, all that stuff. And even that elusive inner peace we're always chasing. And get this, it presents this whole idea of restoration through, well, it calls it a new expression of God's love.
All right, so where do we start?
Well, it jumps right in. The chapter starts with some pretty pointed observations, almost like little jabs, about the things our world often values most.
Like what?
Okay, check out these opening lines. If we do not regard powerful men highly, people will not fight for power. If we do not value rare goods, people will not become thieves. If we display desirable things, we bring confusion to our hearts.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty direct.
Right. So let's take that first one. If we stopped putting powerful people on a pedestal, maybe, just maybe, we'd see less of this constant scramble for power.
It's an interesting thought, right? I mean, we're so used to thinking of leaders and success in terms of authority, dominance, but this is suggesting that if we as a society stopped giving so much weight to those positions, the whole cutthroat competition for them might just fade away.
Exactly. And, it connects this idea to some pretty familiar concepts.
Right.
Well, the footnote sends us to James 2.57, which, warns against favoring the rich and powerful. And then there's Matthew 5.3, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Ah, yes. And when we think about poor in spirit, not just as lacking material things, but as being detached from the whole pursuit of worldly power and status, it really aligns with what this chapter is saying. It's proposing a whole different value system where humility and a sense of inner sufficiency are more important than being on top.
Yeah, it's almost reverse psychology for society. Like, by devaluing the things we're usually told to chase, that power, that status, we might actually create more space for peace. And then it goes on to this idea about rare goods. If we didn't obsess over them, we'd have less theft. I mean, on the surface, it's pretty straightforward. If nobody's fixated on having the latest gadget, the fanciest car, there's less incentive to steal, right?
Makes sense.
But then it connects it to 1 Timothy 6.610, and that adds a whole other layer.
Yeah, 1 Timothy, it talks about how the love of money, that craving for material wealth, that's the root of all kinds of trouble.
Right. So the chapter seems to be saying that by not putting such a high value on these rare goods, we can kind of sidestep that whole obsession and all the problems that come with it.
It's about shifting our focus away from just accumulating stuff.
Right, to something more meaningful.
Exactly.
And then it hits us with this last bit, that displaying all our fancy stuff, all those desirable things, it just messes with our heads.
Brings confusion to our hearts, as it says.
Yeah, and in our world with everyone sharing everything online, that really hits home.
Oh, for sure. Think about it. All those perfectly curated Instagram feeds, the highlight reels.
Right. It's like this constant pressure to show off what we have, what we've achieved.
And it just fuels this cycle of comparison, envy.
And ultimately, you're left feeling empty, like it's never enough.
Yeah, the chapter links this to Matthew 23.2728, which talks about how outward appearances can hide all kinds of inner flaws.
Ah, like a shiny facade.
Exactly. And then there's Romans 8.1827, which speaks to the contrast between our struggles in this life and a future glory. It suggests that our real worth isn't tied to what we can show off.
So listeners, think about it. Have you ever felt that twinge of envy, that urge to buy something just because you saw someone else with it? The chapter is really tapping into something very human here.
It is. And, if we step back and look at this whole opening section, it seems to be saying that if we consciously choose not to overvalue these external markers of success, the power, the wealth, we can actually reduce a lot of internal conflict. And maybe even some big societal issues.
Yeah, it's like it's urging us to find our sense of worth from within, not from chasing external validation.
Exactly. And that sets the stage for where the chapter goes next. It shifts the focus to the role of the Spirit in this whole process of renewal.
Okay, so how does it frame that?
Well, it says, "Thus, one who the Spirit guides leads by declaring our minds and renewing our hearts with grace, softening our selfish ambitions, and strengthening our core with love."
Wow, that sounds like a pretty major internal overhaul.
It is. It's talking about a deep transformation. So let's start with this idea of clearing our minds. The footnotes here point us to a whole bunch of passages in Romans and Galatians. Romans 6.14, 7.46, 7.1425, Galatians 3.1014, and 5.1325. And the overarching theme is about being freed from the law through grace.
Okay, so it's less about rigidly following rules and more about what?
More about having this inner transformation guided by grace. It's about a relationship with the divine that's shaped from the inside out.
So less about checking boxes, more about having this internal compass that's being recalibrated, so to speak. Okay, that makes sense. And then it talks about renewing our hearts with grace, softening selfish ambitions, and strengthening our core with love.
Right. And the key reference here is Philippians 2.1-8, which is often called the mind of Christ passage. It's a really powerful call to humility, to putting others first, the opposite of selfish ambition.
So the Spirit's guidance is about nurturing that Christ-like mindset within us.
Exactly. It's about a fundamental shift away from ego and toward love.
Wow, the chapter is really emphasizing that the real change happens inside, isn't it?
It is. It's not just about outward actions, but about transforming our inner motivations, our desires. And that brings us to the next key idea, freedom from desires. The chapter states it very directly. The Spirit guides us away from our desires, so those who cleverly scheme have no power over us.
That's so relevant today. I mean, we're constantly bombarded with messages trying to make us want more, crave more.
Oh, absolutely. The footnotes here point us to Romans 13.14 and Galatians 5.17, both of which talk about this conflict between our earthly desires, what the Bible often calls the flesh, and the leading of the Spirit.
Okay, so if we align ourselves with the Spirit,
We become less susceptible to all those external pressures, less vulnerable to manipulation.
it's like we build up this internal resistance to temptation.
Exactly. When our focus shifts from gratifying our own desires to seeking the Spirit's guidance, we gain a kind of detachment, a freedom.
I like that. And then the chapter wraps up this section with this almost poetic statement, be still and everything will be in order. And it gives us a footnote to Psalm 37.7:15. This idea of stillness, it almost feels radical in our always-on world.
What's really interesting here is that it's not talking about being passive, about doing nothing. It's about actively trusting in a higher power's plan and timing.
So it's not about just sitting back and letting things happen.
It's about letting go of our need to control every outcome and finding peace in the assurance that things will ultimately work out according to a bigger plan. Psalm 37 talks about waiting patiently and trusting in that bigger picture.
That's really powerful. Okay, so we've explored this whole idea of restore. What's next?
Well, the chapter then moves into a section titled Renewal, where it introduces a practical framework. It's called the Trinitarian method. It's also referred to as MAP.
MAP, okay. What's that all about?
It breaks this idea of renewal down into three key areas: mindset, aim, and practice. The chapter explains that God's love shapes our mindset, our trust in the Son directs our aim, and our faith in the Holy Spirit guides our practice.
Okay, so it's about taking these big ideas and making them, well, actionable.
Exactly. And each element builds directly on the themes we just explored in the Restore section.
Let's break it down then, starting with mindset,
All right, the first point under mindset is value humility over power.
which ties directly back to those opening lines about, not putting powerful people on a pedestal and not obsessing over possession.
Right. It's about shifting our priorities, focusing on inner peace rather than chasing external validation. And it even gives us some specific references, Matthew 6.19, 10-1, about where we store our treasures.
And James 4.7 about humbling ourselves before God.
Exactly. It's about a fundamental reorientation of what we consider truly important.
And then the second point under mindset is clear the mind, renew the heart.
Which connects to this idea of being guided by the Spirit, right?
Exactly. It's about being open to spiritual renewal, letting go of distractions, and cultivating love and humility. It references Romans 12.2 about renewing our minds.
And Philippians 4.7 about guarding our hearts with peace.
Right. It's about making space for spiritual growth,
Okay, so the third element of mindset is let go of desires and selfish ambitions.
which obviously builds on the idea that the Spirit guides us away from those desires.
It does.
Mhm.
And it encourages us to loosen our grip on those fleeting desires and trust in a bigger plan. It references Matthew 6.33 about seeking God's kingdom first.
And 1 John 2.16, which talks about how worldly desires don't come from God.
It's about recognizing the danger of unchecked ambition.
And the final point under mindset is embrace stillness and trust in God's order.
Which takes us right back to that idea of be still.
Exactly. It's about finding peace and clarity by trusting in God's control and plan. It references Psalm 46.sin, be still and know that I am God.
And Isaiah 30.15 about finding strength in quietness and trust.
Okay, so mindset is all about shifting our perspective, our values. What about aim? How does that differ?
Think of aim as the direction that flows from that renewed mindset. It's what we intentionally set our sights on.
So it's about taking those mindset principles and turning them into goals.
Exactly. So, for example, just as we cultivate a mindset that values humility over power, the corresponding aim is to focus on humility and simplicity rather than pursuing power and status.
And it gives us Matthew 6.19-11 and Philippians 2.3-4 to back that up.
Right. It's about intentionally prioritizing others and those more lasting treasures over fleeting worldly gains.
Okay, and what about the clear the mind, renew the heart mindset?
That translates into the aim to seek spiritual renewal and clarity of mind through the guidance of the Holy Spirit. It gives us Romans 12.2 and John 14.26.
Where it talks about the Holy Spirit as a teacher and guide. So it's about actively seeking that renewal.
Exactly. And then the mindset of letting go of desires naturally leads to the aim to detach from selfish desires and worldly ambitions, again with supporting scriptures like Matthew 6.33 and 1 John 2.16.
So it's about making that detachment a conscious goal.
Right. And finally, embrace stillness and trust becomes the aim to cultivate stillness and trust that God's word will prevail, referencing Psalm 46.in and Isaiah 30.15. It's about actively seeking out that stillness where we can truly connect with God.
Okay, so we've got the right mindset, we've set our aim, now what? How do we actually make this happen?
That's where practice comes in. It's about turning those principles and goals into concrete actions, habits we build into our lives.
So how do we practice value humility?
The chapter suggests cultivating a lifestyle of humility and simplicity. Things like serving others without needing recognition, putting others first. It references Matthew 6.19-21 and Philippians 2.3-4 again.
And how do we put clear the mind, renew the heart into practice?
It talks about engaging in regular spiritual practices that renew your mind and heart. Things like prayer, meditation, reflection. It uses Romans 12.2 and John 14.26 as support.
So making that connection with the Spirit a regular part of our lives.
Exactly. And then let go of desires and selfish ambitions becomes the practice of making conscious choices to say no to things that don't align with our values, with scriptures like Matthew 6.33 and 1 John 2.16 to guide us.
It's about aligning our actions with our inner detachment.
Right. And finally, embrace stillness and trust becomes the practice of cultivating moments of stillness and trust in God's plan, even when things are tough. It uses Psalm 46.9 and Isaiah 30.15 for support.
It's about building that habit of finding peace in God's presence.
Exactly. So this MAP framework gives us a really practical way to understand and actually live out this spirit of renewal.
It does. Okay, so we've covered restore, we've covered renewal. What's next in the chapter?
Well, then it moves into a section called respond, which is really interesting.
Okay, what's that all about?
It shifts the focus to dialogue, to recognizing shared truths across different cultures and religions.
Okay.
It revisits those four themes we've been exploring: humility, spiritual renewal, detachment from desires, and stillness. And it shows us how they show up in different traditions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. It even gives specific references to their scriptures.
So it's showing us that these aren't just isolated Christian ideas, they're universal.
Exactly. For example, with humility and simplicity,
Yeah.
it gives us Matthew 5.3 from Christianity, alongside Quran 15.8 from Islam, Dhammapada 2.23 from Buddhism, and Bhagavad Gita 13.8-12 from Hinduism.
Wow. And does it explain how those all connect?
It has a section called How This Unites Us, which points out that humility tends to lessen conflict and promote selflessness across all these different traditions.
That's pretty amazing. And then it gives us real-world applications.
It does. For humility, it suggests choosing moderation in our consumption and serving others without expecting anything in return.
Okay, so what about spiritual renewal? What does it say about that?
Well, for spiritual renewal, it shows us Romans 12.2 from Christianity and Quran 22.38 from Islam, along with perspectives from Buddhist and Hindu traditions. The key idea is that real change comes from a source beyond ourselves.
And the real-world application.
It suggests seeking divine guidance through prayer or meditation before making big decisions.
That's a good one. What about detachment from desires?
For that, it brings together 1 Timothy 6.6 from Christianity, Quran 13.28, teachings on the Four Noble Truths from Buddhism, and Bhagavad Gita 2.70. The unifying thread is that excessive attachment to worldly desires causes suffering, while detachment brings peace.
So it's about letting go.
Exactly. And the practical application encourages simplifying our lifestyles, focusing on meaningful relationships and faith rather than just accumulating possessions.
I like that. Okay, last one. Stillness and trust in divine order. What's the universal connection there?
It shows us Psalm 46.10 from Christianity, Quran 57.4 from Islam, Dhammapada 2.24 from Buddhism, and Bhagavad Gita 6.5 from Hinduism. And the common thread is that stillness helps us connect with the divine.
That makes sense. And the real-world application.
It's just setting aside time for quiet reflection and trusting in a bigger plan, even when we're stressed.
It's amazing to see these consistent threads running through all these different traditions. It really highlights that these are universal human experiences, aspirations.
It does, and the chapter ends with a nice, concise summary. It reminds us of the three sections: restore, renewal, and respond, the 3 R's.
The 3 R's, right.
And it includes this great quote by St. Thomas Aquinas: truth cannot contradict truth. It really drives home the point that even though these principles are expressed in different ways, they point to a shared reality.
They do. So, to wrap up our deep dive into this chapter, we've explored the call to re-examine our values, to shift our focus away from worldly power and wealth.
We talked about the importance of spiritual renewal, being guided by the Spirit.
We looked at the freedom that comes from detaching from selfish desires.
And we considered the power of stillness and trust in a higher order.
We explored the MAP framework as a way to put these ideas into practice.
And finally, we saw how these themes resonate across different religious traditions.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that these longings for peace, for purpose, for connection, they're universal.
They are.
So, listeners, here's something to think about. Considering all these common threads, what's one small shift you could make in your mindset or your daily routine to cultivate a bit more stillness, a bit less attachment to those fleeting worldly things? It's something worth pondering as you go about your day. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.